They said nobody slept outside JM Tower for more than one night. Not because the security guards chased people away, not because the marble entrance was too cold, but because the building belonged to Julian Kang Min Jae. And everyone in Seoul, from the boardrooms on the 70th floor to the gutters beneath the Han River Bridge, knew what that name meant. To the corporate world, he was the Korean-American billionaire CEO of JM Holdings, a man whose signature moved markets, whose silence in a boardroom made CFOs sweat through their suits, whose name, whispered in the right ear, could open doors that laws couldn't. To the underworld, he was something else entirely. Untouchable, precise, dangerous in the way quiet men always are, not because they shout, but because when they finally speak, it is already too late. He controlled shipping routes that governments pretended didn't exist. He owned private security firms that answered to no badge. He had politicians in his pocket so deep they had forgotten what it felt like to have a spine. Half the secrets buried beneath Seoul had his fingerprints on the shovel. No one loitered near his tower. No one watched his entrance. No one survived being noticed by him. Until her. Zariah Monroe arrived on a Tuesday with a torn backpack, a dead phone, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night. It comes from 100 of them stacked on top of each other, until standing upright feels like a miracle. She had nowhere else to go, so she stayed. Not loudly, not desperately. She didn't beg the doorman or sob on the marble steps. She didn't make herself a problem. She simply existed in the space beside the fountain outside his building, folding her blanket with the precision of someone who had decided that dignity was the one thing she refused to surrender. Every morning before sunrise, she was gone. Every evening after dark, she returned. For 3 weeks, Min Jae watched her from his tinted elevator glass as it descended 70 floors of glass and steel between them, and still something made him look. She read. That was the thing that caught him. Not novels, not paperbacks with broken spines. She read discarded business newspapers, his world's newspapers. Smoothed the crumpled pages against her knee and read them the way students read textbooks deliberately, like she was memorizing a language she intended to speak one day. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself she was nobody, a ghost outside a building, a problem that would solve itself. He told himself a lot of things, standing in that elevator, watching the numbers drop. Then came the midnight. Rain had been falling for hours, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just appears and stays, turning the marble plaza into a mirror of cold light. Min Jae stepped out of the tower at 12:47 a.m., the way he always did when the numbers in his head refused to quiet. He didn't see the black sedan. He didn't hear the engine too slick, too fast, moving without headlights through the rain-soaked street like something that wasn't supposed to exist. But she saw it. The girl with the torn backpack and the dead phone and the newspaper she had folded into her jacket to keep dry, she saw it. And the girl who never cried loudly enough for anyone to hear opened her mouth and split the night in two. Move! One word. From nobody. That saved everything. The first gunshot shattered the glass doors behind Julian Kang Min Jae. The second tore through the space where his chest had been, where his heart still hammered, suddenly remembering it was mortal. The only reason he was still breathing was because Zariah had thrown herself at him. Not with training, not with calculation, with the desperate animal force of someone who had already lost everything and had therefore stopped fearing loss entirely. She hit him like a wave hits a wall, total, graceless, committed, and they crashed together onto the wet pavement as the world above them came apart in glass and fire. His bodyguards moved. Weapons came out. Commands exploded in Korean. The sedan smashed into the concrete barrier at the tower's edge with a sound like a building falling. Rain filled the air between the gunshots. Screams, burning rubber, blood mixing with the cold Seoul midnight. For one suspended second, Min Jae lay on the marble beneath this woman, this nobody, this ghost who slept beside fountains and stared up at her face. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. Her eyes were wide and glassy, processing shock the way the body does when the mind refuses to. But she had not run. She had not hidden. She had moved toward the danger while every trained man in his employ was still reaching for a weapon. His men reached her first. Two of them dragged her backward by the arms, shouting rapid-fire Korean. She could be part of it. She knew where he would be standing. Get her on the ground. Min-jae watched them pull her away from him and felt something shift in his chest that he had no vocabulary for. He raised one hand. The street went silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. 12 armed men, 3 bodyguards. His driver with a weapon drawn, all of them still, all of them watching his hand like it was the only clock in the world. He got to his feet slowly, straightening his jacket as though the pavement had not just tried to become his grave. His eyes moved to her. Zaraya stood between two of his men, her wrists locked in their grips, her torn backpack hanging off one shoulder, her chest heaving. Her lips were split from where she had hit the ground. There was blood at her temple, a graze from the concrete, not a bullet, but enough to make the red run dark against her skin in the downpour. She looked at him the way no one had looked at him in 15 years. Not with fear, not with calculation. With absolute, uncomplicated uncertainty. Like she genuinely had no idea what came next and had accepted that she never would. "What's your name?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. Her chin lifted a fraction, that same dignity he had watched through elevator glass for 3 weeks. Zaraya. Just that. No last name offered. No plea attached. No performance. He studied her for a long moment. Long enough that Noah Park shifted behind him. Long enough that the rain soaked through the shoulders of what had been, 40 seconds ago, a $12,000 jacket. She expected to be sent back into the street. He could see it in her eyes, the bracing, the old, familiar preparation for rejection. Instead, Julian Kang Min-jae turned toward his tower and spoke 2 words that restructured the atmosphere of the entire block. Bring her upstairs. Zaraya had slept in places that would make most people's skin crawl. Train station bathrooms with broken locks. 1. Doorways that smelled like diesel and old rain. A church porch in November, where the cold came through the concrete and wrapped around her bones like something with intent. She had learned to sleep light, to sleep fast, to sleep without expecting safety on the other side. Nothing, not one night of her life, had prepared her for this. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of JM Tower. Black marble floors so polished they held your reflection back at you like an accusation. Walls of glass that turned Seoul into a painting, 10 million lights spread below like something God had dropped and decided to leave. Furniture that existed in that particular category of expensive, where it stopped looking like furniture and started looking like philosophy. The silence was the strangest part. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of absence. The silence of control, the kind that costs money to maintain, that requires staff to enforce and architecture to protect. The silence of a man who had decided long ago that chaos was something that happened to other people. Min-jae stood at the far end of the room, removing blood-stained cufflinks with the focused calm of someone completing a task they had done 1,000 times. His jacket was already gone. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, whether from the fall or the glass, Zaraya couldn't tell. He dropped the cufflinks onto a glass dish without looking at where they landed. They made a sound like punctuation. "You saved my life," he said. Not warmly, factually, like a man updating an internal ledger. Zaraya stood near the elevator doors, still dripping onto floors worth more than everything she had ever owned combined. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I just reacted." He turned then and looked at her in a way she wasn't prepared for, not the sweeping assessment of a man sizing up a woman, but something slower and more unsettling, like he was reading a document he hadn't expected to find interesting. "That answer," he said quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 4 years." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. By morning, his men had rebuilt her life in a single file. Zariah Monroe, 23, African American, born in Baltimore, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts and still found time to teach her daughter that poverty was not a personality. Full scholarship to Yonsei University's International Business Program, revoked after her mother's diagnosis, consumed her focus and her savings simultaneously. Medical debt, unpaid tuition, no living family in Korea, no gang affiliations, no criminal record, no reason whatsoever to be anywhere near an assassination attempt on the most dangerous man in Seoul. Just grief, just survival, just a woman who had run out of softer places to land. Min-jae read the file at his desk while she slept finally deeply, the sleep of someone whose body had simply overruled their anxiety in the guest room down the hall. But the report changed nothing strategically, because Zariah had been present. She had seen the sedan. She had seen the passenger. And in Min-jae's world, a witness wasn't a person. A witness was a liability wearing a face. He closed the file. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seoul glittered and breathed, indifferent to the fact that the homeless girl who had been sleeping beside its fountains had just become, overnight, the most complicated problem in the most dangerous empire in the city. The trader's name arrived before sunrise, the way bad news always does, quietly, without warning, in the middle of a moment when you have almost convinced yourself things might be manageable. Min-jae's intelligence team confirmed it in 11 minutes. The black sedan had not been a guess. Someone had leaked his movements, the specific exit, the specific time, the 30-second window between when the lobby cameras cycled and when his lead car pulled around. That wasn't luck. That wasn't surveillance. That was access. Internal access. The kind that only came from inside. They brought photographs, stills from the hotel cameras across the street, cleaned up and sharpened. Min-jae laid them on the conference table without expression. When Zariah walked in dressed in clothes his housekeeper had sourced overnight, too large at the shoulder, too long at the ankle, but clean, she stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the photographs the way she had looked at those business newspapers. Deliberately, like she was reading for something specific, her finger came down on one image, the passenger seat of the sedan. A profile visible through the shattered glass for less than a second of footage. A jaw, an ear. The specific way a man holds his neck when he is watching something he arranged himself. Him, she said. That's the man who was watching you. Before the car accelerated, he was watching to confirm the law. The room went cold in the particular way rooms go cold when the answer is worse than the question. Ethan Lee Tae-sung, Captain. 9 years of loyalty. The man who had stood beside Min-jae at his father's funeral and sworn, in the old way, in the language that meant something, that he would die before he broke faith. Noah Park, Jun-ho, Min-jae's Korean-American second-in-command, architect of every strategic move Min-jae had made for 6 years, said what every man in that room was calculating. She knows too much. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like arithmetic, like the solution was self-evident, and the only question was, who performed it? Zariah's blood moved differently in her veins for a moment. She had heard that tone before, in the voice of a hospital administrator telling her mother's insurance had lapsed, in the voice of a landlord explaining that sympathy didn't extend past the first of the month. The tone of men doing math with other people's lives. Min-jae didn't look at Noah. He looked at her. No one touches her. 4 words, delivered so quietly they should have been easy to dismiss. Instead, they rearranged the gravitational pull of the room. Noah went still. The 2 men flanking the door adjusted their posture. Even the city beyond the glass seemed to dim slightly, as though registering the shift. But Zariah understood what she was, too tired and too honest to pretend otherwise. By protecting her publicly, Min-jae had made her visible. By bringing her inside his tower, he had made her valuable. And in a world built entirely on leverage, value and safety were not the same thing. They were opposites. She had stopped being invisible the moment she screamed in the rain. And now every enemy he had, and Julian Kang Min-jae had assembled enemies the way other men assembled wealth, would look at the girl from outside the tower and see not a person, but a pressure point, a place to push. She understood all of this. She stayed anyway, because the street was still out there, and the street had already shown her what it did to women who had nothing. At least here, the danger had a face. Fear, Zariah had learned, was loudest at 2 a.m. That was the hour when the body stopped pretending it was fine, when the adrenaline that had kept her functional for the past 18 hours finally metabolized and left behind only the trembling residue of everything she had survived. She lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and at a light fixture worth more than 3 months of the rent she no longer paid. She listened to the silence of the penthouse and felt her mind accelerate towards something she couldn't outrun. She got up. Min-jae's private study was unlocked. She would wonder about that later, whether it was oversight or test, and she pushed the door open with the intention of finding something boring enough to slow her thoughts. Numbers had always done that for her. Her mother had called it a gift. Her professors had called it exceptional analytical aptitude. Zariah called it the only thing that made the world feel navigable, because numbers didn't soften bad news and they didn't dress up cruelty in polite language. Numbers said exactly what was true. The glass desk held a stack of documents his team had delivered after the attack. Port manifests, shipment records, financial transfers across 6 subsidiary companies. She sat down, not snooping, just settling, and pulled the first page toward her the way she had pulled those discarded newspapers toward her on the fountain steps. She read, and then she read again. The same transfer every month. The same routing code. The same amount, not a round number, which would have been sloppy, but a precise figure with decimal points. The kind of precision that was designed to look legitimate because it mimicked payroll. Moved from JM Holdings into a charitable foundation registered under Seoul's Urban Redevelopment Initiative. She cross-referenced the dates against the shipment records. Her hands moved without her directing them, the way they always did when the numbers began speaking. The foundation received the transfer. Within 72 hours, an equivalent sum moved outward fragmented, scattered across 4 accounts in 3 countries, laundered down to untraceable noise. She found Ethan Lee Tae-sung's approval stamp on the 6th page. She found a second signature on the 9th. Victor Han Sung-wook, Min-jae's oldest political ally. A Korean-American power broker who had built his career moving between Seoul, Los Angeles, and Washington like borders were suggestions. The man who had testified on behalf of JM Holdings during 2 separate government investigations. The man whose name appeared in Min-jae's files, not in the column marked enemies, but in the one marked foundations. Zariah sat very still for a long moment. Then the study door opened. Min-jae stood in the frame jacket gone, collar open, the burn of sleeplessness at the edges of his eyes, and looked at her, sitting at his desk, surrounded by his most sensitive documents. She expected fury. What she saw was something she couldn't immediately name. Not anger. Something older and more complicated than anger. She turned the document toward him. Her finger landed on Victor Han's signature. "Your traitor," she said quietly, "isn't working alone. And whoever gave the order didn't just want you dead tonight." She paused, making sure he was following. "They wanted you unprepared when they came for the empire." The room between them changed temperature. Min-jae crossed to the desk slowly and looked at what she had found, at the pattern she had pulled from hours of documents that his own team had held and missed. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "How did you see this?" Zariah looked up at him. "Numbers don't hide," she said. "People just stop looking." 3 days later, Min-jae dressed her in midnight blue and took her into the Lion's Mouth. The Seoul International Trade Gala occupied the Grand Hyatt's ballroom in the way that power always occupies a room completely, without apology, rearranging the air to accommodate itself. 500 of the city's most polished people moved through champagne light in silk and tailoring that cost more than most people earned in a year, performing the elaborate theater of alliance and ambition that ran Seoul's real economy. Zaraya understood immediately why Min Jae had brought her. She was bait, not a secret. He told her plainly in the car, the way he told her everything without cushioning, without the paternalistic softening that men used when they wanted compliance, without accountability. Han knows you identified Taesung. He doesn't know what else you have seen. Appearing with me tonight tells him the answer is everything, and that I have chosen to protect it by keeping it close. And if he decides close isn't close enough, then we find out tonight who else is with him. He looked at her across the car's interior. You can refuse. She looked back. You would take me anyway, she said. Not an accusation. Arithmetic. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost, yes, he admitted. But I would feel worse about it. So she walked in beside him in midnight blue with her hair pulled back and her spine straight, and she watched Seoul's most powerful people realize that the homeless girl from outside the tower was now inside the room. And she watched them process that realization in real time across their carefully composed faces. Min Jae noticed every stare. Zaraya noticed something else. She noticed Ethan Lee Tae-sung near the eastern bar, and the way his right hand moved to his jacket pocket when he saw her. She noticed the woman in a red gown at the edge of the dance floor, whose lips moved almost imperceptibly, speaking into a calm, not a companion. She noticed a waiter moving through the room with the focused efficiency of someone executing, not serving. She pressed close to Min Jae's arm. Tae-sung just passed something to Han. Silver drive, his breast pocket. Her voice was steady, low, locked between them. The woman in red near the pillars has an earpiece. The waiter with the gray lapel pin isn't on staff. I watched the others working, and he hasn't taken a single drink order. Min Jae's hand moved to the small of her back. Not tenderness, coordination. Time to leave, he said. They didn't make it. The chandeliers died all at once, dropping 500 people into dark and instant chaos. And in the 3 seconds of blindness before the emergency lighting stuttered on, Zaraya felt cold metal against the base of her spine. A voice reached her ear, shaped around a smile. Tell the boss to come alone, it said, or the girl dies first. They took her down 4 floors in a service elevator that smelled of industrial cleaner and cold metal. Her shoes were gone, lost, somewhere in the scramble on the ballroom floor, and her bare feet registered every crack in the parking garage's concrete as they walked her through the dark in a grip she knew better than to fight. Not yet. Not here, where the geometry was wrong and she couldn't see the exits and the echoes would betray any sound she made. So Zaraya counted instead. Columns, cars, the distance between the elevator and the farthest wall. The number of footsteps behind her. The slight drag in one captor's gate right side. A limp he was managing. Every detail landing in her mind, the way numbers landed. Precise. Usable. Victor Han Sung-wook materialized from the shadows near a row of black vehicles, the way men who believed they had already won tended to, slowly, theatrically, with the particular comfort of someone who had never personally had to clean up after himself. He looked well for a traitor. Expensive suit, reading glasses folded in his breast pocket, the settled confidence of a man who had spent 50 years learning which rooms to own. He looked at Zaraya the way he probably looked at furniture he had decided to dispose of. Then, the elevator opened again. Julian Kang Min Jae walked out alone. No guards. No entourage. No visible weapon until his hand moved, and suddenly there was one. It appeared with the practiced ease of a man for whom violence was simply a language he happened to be fluent in. Black suit. Blood at his collar from somewhere she hadn't seen. Eyes that had rearranged their entire expression into something that made the men flanking Han shift their weight. Han smiled, indulgent, like a teacher watching a student make a noble and futile argument. You became weak, he said, over a homeless girl. Min Jae's voice came back so quietly The garage had to go completely still to carry it. No. I became dangerous. The first shot came from Han's left. The garage became noise and motion, and Zaraya dropped to the concrete the way she had learned to drop fast, flat, small, and crawled beneath the nearest vehicle, as the air above her filled with things that would end her if they touched her. The cold of the concrete floor registered dimly against her palms, the smell of burnt air, the screaming of car alarms triggered by percussion. She saw him through the gap beneath the cars. A gunman, down on one knee, wounded, she realized, from the way he held himself but raising his weapon toward the blind side of Min Jae's movement. Lining up the shot with the specific patience of someone who knew they only needed one. Zaraya looked left. Fire extinguisher, mounted to the column 4 feet from her hand. She had never thrown anything with accuracy in her life. She grabbed it anyway. The extinguisher left her hands with all of her weight behind it and missed the gunman completely, which she had honestly expected. Instead, it hit the overhead sprinkler pipe above him with a sound like a bell struck wrong. The pipe gave. Water cascaded down in a sudden violent sheet, and the exposed electrical conduit running parallel sparked once magnificently. The entire section of the garage short-circuited in a crackling collapse of light that dropped the gunman and 2 men beside him where they stood. Silence arrived in pieces. Then Min Jae was crouching beside her, pulling her upright from beneath the vehicle, and she was already talking. The pipe. I was aiming for the pipe. You were not. I absolutely was. And Julian Kang Min Jae, the most feared man in Seoul, the untouchable, the man whose silence made CFOs sweat through their suits, laughed. Low and sudden and real, like something had escaped before he could stop it. You are chaos, he said, and pulled her into his arms. She let herself lean there for exactly 3 seconds. Then he pulled back. Han was gone, and the flash drive with everything they needed had gone with him. By morning, the city had decided Julian Kang Min Jae was finished. The news channels ran it as corruption, as reckoning, as the inevitable collapse of an empire built on secrets, framed in the language of justice that powerful men always deployed when they were dismantling a rival. JM Holdings stock halted. Board members, the ones Han had spent 2 years quietly repositioning, Zaraya now understood, released a joint statement expressing grave concern and fiduciary responsibility, the twin liturgies of corporate betrayal. Police perimeters surrounded the tower by noon. By evening, his captains had fractured. Some waited, most calculated. 3 had already made calls that Min Jae's remaining loyalists intercepted and reported with the flat affect of people delivering news they wished wasn't true. Zaraya sat in the operations room and watched it happen in real time across 6 screens and understood, finally, the full geometry of what Han had built. Not an assassination, an erasure. Kill him, and he becomes a martyr. His empire consolidates around grief. But discredit him, flood the channels with enough evidence, real and constructed, to make his own organization doubt the ground they are standing on, and the empire doesn't just fall. It collapses from the inside, and everyone within it scrambles to be on the right side of the rubble. Han had spent years building this. The foundation, the transfers, the positioned board members, the political relationships. Ethan Lee Tae-sung as the internal wound. The assassination attempt had been real, but it had also been acceptable collateral, because whether Min Jae died in the rain or died in the press, the outcome was the same. She told Min Jae at midnight. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was how he received information he intended to use. The drive, she said. Everything Han has is on it. The transfers, the manufacturing of the evidence, the board communications. If we can, I know where he will use it, Min Jae said. The emergency board meeting, tomorrow morning. He will play it there, in front of everyone, so there is no private negotiation possible. Public execution. Then we need the original files, Zaraya said. The real ones. Your records. I saw them in the system 3 days ago, the clean transfer logs, the unmodified port manifests. If I can pull them before Han presents his version, the tower shook. Not metaphorically. The explosion hit the executive floors above them and turned the world into sound and pressure and falling ceiling. Min-jae had her by the arm before the debris finished moving, pulling her through a smoke-thick hallway toward the private emergency elevator at the building's core. She pulled against him. "The server room," she said. "Floor 42. I can get the—" "There is no time." "There is, if you give me 4 minutes." He stopped, looked at her. The hallway was filling with smoke and the sound of men and violence coming down from above. He looked at her for 2 full seconds in the burning dark and made the calculation she could see him making. 3 minutes, he said. "Then Noah pulls you out regardless." She ran. He went back toward the fire. When the elevator doors closed between them and she was descending, the top floors of JM Tower broke open above her in a bloom of orange light. Zariah pressed her hand flat against the doors and screamed his name until the sound was the only thing in the world. She had the files. She didn't know if he was alive. 48 hours. That was how long Zariah sat with the evidence, the silence, and the particular species of grief that arrives before the body has been found, the worst kind? The kind that won't let you mourn cleanly because it won't confirm what you are mourning. Noah's men had pulled her from the building. She had screamed at them. She had stopped screaming when she understood that screaming was a luxury the moment couldn't afford. Then she started working instead. Because working was the only language she had left that the situation would accept. She rebuilt the case in 48 hours on a laptop in a safe house that smelled like instant coffee and old carpet, cross-referenced the files she had pulled with the transfer records she had memorized, constructed the evidentiary chain that a forensic accountant would need, formatted it in the clean, declarative language of numbers that couldn't be argued with because they didn't care who was arguing. On the morning of the board meeting, Victor Han Sung-wook arrived at JM Holdings' boardroom wearing victory the way men who had planned long wore it like a suit that finally fit. He arranged his people around the table. Ethan Lee Tae-sung, at the right. 3 board members who had made their choice. 2 directors who had been positioned like chess pieces over years of small favors and careful patience. He placed the flash drive on the table, smiled at the room, opened his mouth. The boardroom doors opened. Julian Kang Min-jae walked in. The room did something rooms rarely do. It held its breath as a collective act, because he looked like a man who had walked through fire and considered it a minor inconvenience. Burns at his neck. A cut along his jaw that hadn't been properly closed. He walked with the particular gait of someone distributing pain across their body as an administrative matter. He looked like the most dangerous thing any of them had ever seen. 1 step behind him, Zariah Monroe walked into the boardroom of JM Holdings for the first time. She had borrowed a black suit from Noah's assistant, too formal, exactly right. She carried a tablet. She looked at every man in the room the way she had learned, in the past week, to look at things she was about to solve. No one spoke. Han's smile didn't disappear. It recalibrated. Became the smile of a man adjusting strategy rather than conceding ground. "Impressive," he said. "Resurrection. But the evidence." "Zariah," Min-jae said. Just her name. She connected the tablet to the boardroom display. The screen filled. Bank transfers in Han's name. The charitable foundation's true account structure. Deleted communications between Han and Ethan Lee Tae-sung recovered from the backup servers on floor 42. Assassination payment records, not theoretical, not reconstructed, but original files with timestamps and authorization signatures. Every secret Han had spent years burying, assembled in the declarative, inarguable language of numbers that Zariah had spoken since she was a child who needed the world to make sense. The room changed. Ethan Lee Tae-sung reached for something at his side. Min-jae moved faster than the sentence was finished. The sound of Tae-sung hitting the boardroom floor was brief and final. Then there were men at every door who had been waiting for exactly this signal. The architecture of Han's plan, so patient, so elaborate, so meticulously constructed over years of small betrayals, came apart in 40 seconds. Han lunged for Zaraya. She stepped back. Min-jae caught Han by the collar before he crossed the table and held him there with the particular grip of a man who had decided how this ended weeks ago. Han went to his knees. The men around him followed, one by one, with the mechanical resignation of a structure whose load-bearing wall had just been removed. When it was over, the room was very quiet again. Zaraya's hands were shaking. She looked down at them and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of reaction, the trembling, the release of breath, the burning at the back of her eyes that she refused to let become anything more specific. And then she looked up. Min-jae was watching her. Not the room, not the men on their knees, not the board members calculating their next realignment. Her. She crossed the room to him because the distance felt wrong, and she was finished, she realized, pretending that the distance was appropriate. "I was just the girl outside your tower," she said. It wasn't self-pity. It was the only way she knew to describe the distance between what she had been 7 days ago and whatever she was now. Min-jae's expression did the thing she had been watching it learn to do. It softened. Not broadly, not for the room. A precision softening, directed entirely at her, like a frequency only she could receive. "No," he said. "You were the woman who walked into my darkness and made it afraid of you." He kissed her in front of the empire that had once built itself around his isolation, in front of the men who had betrayed him, in front of the men who had stayed loyal, in front of the city of Seoul, glittering 70 floors below them through walls of glass. Zaraya kissed him back and understood, finally, what the numbers had been telling her since the night she screamed in the rain. She had not been rescued by the Korean Mafia boss. She had never needed rescuing. She had been seen fully, dangerously, irreversibly by the one man in the city powerful enough to understand what she was worth. And that, it turned out, had changed everything. For both of them.